The Natives people have occupied the lands of Canada for thousands of years, far before the Europeans had settled. Although the Natives people have probably felt the sting of intolerance more than any other race has within Canada, not as immigrants that were unwanted, but as an owner whose land was simply stolen from them. Over approximately 40,000 years, the Natives people have created great civilizations. However, as the years passed, the Europeans felt more at home and gradually pushed the natives out of their own lands. At the beginning of the 1920s, the way of life for Canadian Natives people began to erode by the government and social policy. Ceremonies like the Sundance were still banned, and the Natives' children were taken away from their home to be educated in residential schools run by the government's religious organizations. Anything that was connected with the natives' language or heritage was excluded from the school life in an effort to assimilate the young generation into the mainstream of the Canadian life. Other policies guaranteed that Natives people would be dependent on the federal government that limited their freedom and followed policies of assimilation. If the Natives people chose to live on the reserves, their votes would have no value within the country.
In settling this question without further delay by renewing our federal pact and our sense of belonging to this country. Through this renewal will come the other changes, economic, social, and cultural, to which we are entitled. It is time for action. The objective of the document I've just tabled is precisely to start this process. It sets out the principles of this renewal and their application to the workings of our federal system and to the institutions provided for in the Constitution. It is no coincidence that it is entitled A Time for Action.
In the early 1990s, immigrants and Canadians from farms in small towns flocked to the growing factories. However, for some Canadians, this expansion was not a benefit. By the early 19th century, more and more land was being settled by immigrants or mapped and claimed by mining or government officials. Most Natives people were being moved into land reserved for them. Without looking upon their rights once, the Canadian immigrants continued to push Natives into the margins of Canadian society. The Indian Act, which was formed between 1876 and 1895, was designed to encourage Natives people to give up their culture and tradition. Natives people could not earn a university degree, become a lawyer, doctor, or ministers, and still be considered status Indians. The general public, and especially the government, believed that education would help the Natives people adapt to the changing world. Many Natives were sent to residential schools. In 1946, the federal government created a committee made up of the members of the House of Commons and Senate to consider the changes to the Indian Act. In the hearing, which lasted until 1948, the committee learned of the difficulties many Natives people were facing. Aboriginal incomes were often a fraction of those who were Canadian, and living conditions on reserves were often appalling, resulting to much lower health standards. For the first time, Natives leaders were given an opportunity to put their concerns to the government. In 1951, these leaders succeeded in having some changes made to the Indian Act, giving Natives people more personal rights, such as the rights to perform ceremonies that had been illegal in the earlier century. Tribal leaders were also given more control over decisions on reserves, although the Canadian Affairs Department could overrule their decisions at any time. James Gladstone, a native Indian, was brought up on a reserve in southern Alberta, where he became a successful farmer. He was the first farmer on the reserve to buy a tractor. In 1948, he was elected the president in the Indian Association of Alberta. Gladstone was influential in dealing with the federal government on initiatives such as the 1951 revisions to the Indian Act. In 1958, he became the first treaty Indian to be a senator. Gladstone was also responsible for helping to gain treaty Indians to the right to vote in 1960. In the 1960s, Native leaders made it clear that traditional rights, which included hunting year-round and land claims, had to be top priorities for the federal government. However, despite these demands, the Trudeau government prepared a policy document known as the White Paper that ignored these priorities. In the 1960s, the struggle for Aboriginal rights reached the crisis in 1969, where there was a move to eliminate special status for Native people. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau believed that there should be no special Canadians, whether they be English-speaking, French-speaking, or Native-speaking. The response to the White Paper. Soon after the White Paper was marked, the Native people rose to action, a time where all Native rights were at a turning point. Natives founded new organizations to protest more effectively. The Indian Brotherhood was founded to represent the status Native people. Elijah Harper was born at Red Sucker Lake in Manitoba. In his early 30s, he was elected chief of the Cree at Red Sucker Lake and went on to be elected as the Manitoba legislator. Harper came to prominence when he argued for Aboriginal rights during the Meech Lake meetings. He stood against the Accord because it did not consider the rights of Aboriginal people. He was also a role model for young Natives.
Indigenous people in our treaty relationship, we look at the treaties as being sacred, very sacred, and they're binding. And the government has not fulfilled the treaty obligations, land questions, revenue sharing. We have rights to education and health, and those benefits would accrue from the land and resources that we shared with the government. And I know that the federal government receives royalties, revenues, generated from these resources, from forestry, mining, gas and oil and fisheries, billions of dollars. I know they have the money, the wherewithal to meet its treaty obligations. But
to this day, he is recognized, respected, and admired by many Native people because he has made a difference in the Natives' rights.